Hello everyone, my name is Martha Sprackland and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the launch of It's Not Personal, the new and wonderful collection by Nigel Pantling. This is Nigel's second full collection of poems, following two pamphlets, Belfast Finds Log and Hip Hind Hook, in which Nigel, who is a former soldier, explores the Cold War and the Troubles in Northern Ireland. In 2016, Nigel published his first full collection, Kingdom, Power, Glory, in which we met characters from the high-powered and often highly ritualized and mysterious worlds of Whitehall and the financial labyrinth of the city. And in this new book, poems are conjured from across a life. Its material is memory, really, but these aren't nostalgic poems. More, it feels as if the past is being brought into the room to sit alongside the present. They're given equal weight. And we'll hear some of these new poems in due course, lucky us. But first of all, as usual, a few bits of housekeeping. I'm sure you're all sort of well-versed in YouTube and Zoom readings by now. It's been a long year and a learning curve, but just so that we're all on the same page, the event will run for about an hour, during which time I will be chatting with Nigel, of course, and with his editor, Ann Sansom, at Smith, Doorstop and the Poetry Business. And we'll also have George Littlejohn from the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, where Nigel is poet in residence. And you'll see, I hope, a chat window to your right. Whether I'm flipped or not, I don't know. Please do feel free to join in the discussion there, say hello, introduce yourself, and do ask any questions that might occur to you. There will be time at the end for me to pull some of those questions out and put them to Nigel. Now, I'm lucky enough to have a copy of this book already, but the rest of you might not have seen it. So for now, I'm delighted to share with you the cover for It's Not Personal, featuring the painting Nonconformist by Leslie Alderker. And Leslie's work is often created in response to political news, to events that she sees in the media. And she says, by responding to social conditions, you know, particularly themes that are pertinent to us at the moment, themes of displacement and belonging and of the shared urban space that many of us call home. And I think Nigel's poems often respond in that same way. And we should be alert to those social conditions too, outside of art, in our current moment more than ever. We're coming into winter now, which is at least very obvious to me here in the middle of a storm. And this is a really terrible time to be living on the streets. Many people are under extreme financial pressure at the moment as the result of a coronavirus crisis. People are losing their jobs, their sources of income. Some are losing their homes. 300,000 people in the UK live without a home, and more than 5,000 of those are on the streets every night. So throughout this reading, Nigel would like to encourage you to please consider donating to the North London Action for the Homeless. Every pound that you can spare goes a very long way, as you can imagine. And those of you who've already donated when you booked your ticket, thank you very much. I'm delighted to say that over £370 has already been raised. That's wonderful. You can find more information on NLAH and on Leslie Alderker through the links on your screen. Well, now I'm delighted to welcome the man of the hour, the author of this wonderful new collection, Nigel Pantling. Nigel, hello. Are you there?
Oh, Martha.
We have you. Great.
We do.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm delighted to be here hosting.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here.
Good. How does it feel to have this new book out in the world?
Well,
you know, a moment of excitement. And what was the process of writing these poems like?
Oh, well, as you say, it's a very strange time to bring out a new book. And one of the reasons we're all here this evening is that we can't meet and have a glass of wine and celebrate it face to face, which is half the fun, really, of publishing a poetry book, that you get to pull your friends and people who like poetry together and celebrate it physically. But it's second best to be able to be here today and talk to you and hopefully talk to a lot of people who are at the end of this broadcast. And I think it'll be fun.
I hope so. These poems, I think, mark out some new ground for you, don't they? Or at least sort of push towards new ground that you perhaps had just touched on before. And reading them, it strikes me that they're deeply personal. In these poems, you're writing about love, about separation, family, about family members who have died, those who are lost to us, in the affecting sequence death in the family I'm talking about. And reading these feels very, very intimate to me, like being taken into confidence. Do you feel that responsibility perhaps to divulge and to share the personal?
Responsibility is I'm not sure I'd see it as a responsibility. I think it's something which I'm glad to be able to do, because I think some of the experiences that I've had, or I write about in this book, are experiences which very many people have had, and perhaps don't know that there are others who felt the same way, or had the same pain, or the same pleasure. And sometimes it's good to know that, and poetry can carry that sort of experience across in a very succinct form. But I think it's also fair to say that quite a lot of what I write about here is work of the imagination, as well as perhaps based on experience. And indeed, the title, It's Not Personal, is intended to let me use that sort of artifice of sometimes writing about things which appear to be about me but aren't, or indeed appear not to be writing about me, but in fact they are about me. And that is a shield in a way for me from feeling that what I'm doing is setting my stall out and asking people to judge me on the basis of some of the very strange and perhaps foolish things I've done in my life. And therefore, by putting them perhaps sometimes in the third person, or by putting facts in them which are transparently not relevant to me, I'm perhaps just protecting myself a bit that way. But also, of course, when I'm making things up, sometimes I'll write about that in the first person, because that makes it more interesting for the reader.
That's really interesting. So it feels like there's a sleight of hand going on there as well. And I found that in other ways in these poems as well. I don't know, particularly many of your poems contain something sort of half said, something almost said. There are lots of lines, it struck me, that say something like, we didn't know what was being said. Something stays hidden between two characters. There's this sort of heard through a wall quality. And then I'm thinking too, of course, about those poems about recruitment by MI6. It sort of feels almost beyond the realm of possibility, that subterfuge and the wink and nudge. But of course, you have written about it, and perhaps that's a good moment for us to hear some of these poems from you, if you'd like to read us some.
Thanks, Arthur. I'd love to. And yes, I will read them on about one of the poems about MI6 in just a second. But I want to start with one which is called On Being Named After a Film Star, because I am actually named after a film star. In the 1940s and 50s, there was an all-action film star hero called Nigel Patrick, who was the Daniel Craig of his day, I suppose. And he used to appear in all the wartime movies, which were very popular immediately after the war. And my mother used to go and watch him a lot. And I think she thought that the sound of Nigel Patrick was probably pretty good, and you never know, it might do for me. So when I came along, that's what I was called. So I'm going to read, first of all, then, On Being Named After a Film Star. Every Saturday evening while she was pregnant, my mother went to see Nigel Patrick at the Odeon. She nibbled popcorn as he overcame impossible odds, leading a platoon of soldiers against the Desert Fox, nursing his Lancaster home on one arthritic engine, or captaining a corvette across the capricious ocean. She must have hoped all this would rub off on me by some cinematic law of nominative determinism. When, years later, he switched to playing the villain, she took to watching me out of the corner of her eye. Martha mentioned MI6, and I've written 2 or 3 times in this book and elsewhere about the experience of being recruited for MI6. And I suppose that was no doubt influenced by a desire to live up to my mother's expectations of having watched Nigel Patrick, because I went to the army first and then tried to join MI6 second. It was a pretty bizarre process, to be absolutely honest. And I'm going to have 2 poems about that in the book. I'm going to read one of them now, which is about the final interview, which I think was about the 4th by the time I got to that stage. It's in 2 parts, and you'll notice there are 2 different voices in this poem. It's something I like doing quite a lot in poetry. I like getting the listener or the reader to understand that there are 2 quite different versions of the same events. So putting them in 2 voices enables me to show that disparity between how one person sees something and how another one does. And that's something which happens all the time in life, and often we never know about it. But this time we do. Final interview for MI6. 1. There are 5 of them this time, seated in a row. No introductions and no name cards. They give you a hard time, but you keep going. Then the young woman, surely the most junior, but doing most of the talking, tells you to imagine you're in a hostile country, and to choose one of them to be the local you have to entrap, suborn, entice, seduce, or otherwise persuade to come over. She gives that look you've got wrong before, so you choose the blimp beside her, and greeting him like an old friend, commiserate on his child's poor health, and then pretend you've had him photographed as he takes your gift of cash. When you arrive home, the offer letter is on the doormat. 2. Slippery bastard chose me. Hello, Mikhail, it's good to see you. Let's have a beer. And I'm so sorry to hear the baby's poorly. Chummy as you like. Perfectly believable. Of course, I just blinked. Took some time to get to the point, but at last he offered me cash for medical treatment. One diplomat to another, no questions asked. When he mentioned the camera, it could have been me 30 years ago. I was for saying no, but none of the others had been in the field. I didn't join MI6, although I could have done. Instead, I joined the Home Office, and the recruitment process there was rather less bizarre, but it still had its moments of strangeness, including the traditional and rather odd ritual of being interviewed by a rather burly ex-policeman who invited me to sign the Official Secrets Act. There is no need to sign the Official Secrets Act. We're all bound by it, whether we sign it or not. But it sort of feels good, I think, to the civil service to bind their civil servants in more thoroughly by getting them to actually to sign and acknowledge their obligations. And I've written about that in a poem called Signing the Act. Signing the Act. Sign here, he says, passing across a blank sheet of paper, to confirm you understand your obligation to the office and won't talk about what you do while working here, no matter how minor you suppose your role. Remember, the smallest detail may have a significance you cannot imagine. Here is the list of 57 countries you cannot visit, in case you give comfort to Her Majesty's enemies, or are tempted into compromise or indiscretion. You will notice that Arcadia and Utopia are included. The Secretary of State wishes the list to be future-proof. Just my little joke. No, we cannot allow you to take a copy, nor may you write down any of the wording. Even to refer to this document or to our meeting constitutes a breach of the Official Secrets Act. Martha mentioned just now that there are some poems in this book about the death in the family. And indeed there are. There's a sequence which I'm going to read next, because this book is dedicated to my sisters, one of whom I'm very glad to say is alive and thriving, and I love her to bits. But the other, very sadly, died a few days after birth. I was about 5 at the time and living in Yorkshire, where my father was a sales rep for Nestle, selling chocolate. And they were very, very hard up, my parents, and of course, very young. And I didn't really appreciate that at all until I got a bit of distance when I went away to university. And this next poem, which is in 5 parts, reflects back on how it must have felt for them. And I just need to explain the title of the last part, which is called Transportation Theory. Transportation theory is a mathematical concept, and it's a theory which I was very enthusiastic about and fascinated by when I was a maths undergraduate in the years about which I'm writing. So, death in the family. One night. That night, she set the body in a shoebox, waiting for a coffin small enough. That night, she balked at telling the boy, fearful he would not cope. That night, she spent upstairs alone, silent. That night, she started down the road that would take her away. The boy slept well that night, dreaming of riding his bike with his new sister. 2, morning. The house is dull. His mother nowhere to be seen. His father grey as ash. A muffled phone call. He catches only the words, "Not been baptized." Later, he takes a note to school. They let him sit at the back, colouring in. 3, funeral. His father borrowed £50 from a colleague at Nestle. It didn't stretch to a headstone. On the day itself, they kept him away, and since then, no one has taken him back to let him mark the place. Now, only his parents know. When they go, they will take his chance to find her and say, "Oh, my sister, what fun we would have had." 4, afterwards. Afterwards, his mother had only miscarriages. Wrung out with the pain of it all, she found herself locked away in a hospital miles from home. He wonders now how that felt, to lose the living as well as the dead. 5, transportation theory. He finds it easy, this mathematical algorithm for minimizing the distance traveled when visiting a fixed number of scattered points. He answers the question and thinks of his father, little older than him, and a sales rep for Nestle, parked in some lay-by on the North York moors, scouring the map for the shortest route to the day's quota of village sweet shops and small-town grocers, distrustful of Southerners and preferring to stick with Roundtree, thank you very much. And his father not able to solve the problem and fearful of returning too early or too late to the dull house and the wrung-out wife, and still bringing no money for the headstone, while around him the rain layers off the moor.
Thank you, Nigel. It's so wonderful to hear the poems in your voice, and that last sequence I find so affecting and so powerful. Now, My day job is as an editor, so I'm always fascinated to hear about a book's life behind the scenes from those who are instrumental in its making. Ann Sansom is director of the poetry business and editor for Smith Doorstop, who have published It's Not Personal, and who have been Nigel's publisher since 2016 through Kingdom, Power, Glory, and the pamphlet Hip Hind Hook. Anne is an absolute stalwart of the business, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, having been a tutor in poetry for more than 30 years and a visiting lecturer at a number of universities. Anne's own collections of poetry are published by Blood Axe, and she's also a playwright. And this is a lovely moment of things coming together for me. Anne was one of my first ever poetry tutors many years ago on an Arvon course. So it's lovely to speak to you today, Anne. Lovely to have you here.
Hello, Martha. Very nice to see you as well. On the stormy south coast, I believe.
On the stormy south coast, yes. I hope it's not too audible over YouTube.
Can't hear it in Sheffield.
Good.
Okay.
So, first of all, what is it about this book, It's Not Personal, that you think is really special? And I'd love it if you could tell us a little about the process of putting it together and editing it with Nigel.
Okay, well, we have published, as you said, other collections by Nigel, which are, the subject matter is very, very unusual. You don't often get, poems written from the viewpoint of, say, a soldier or someone who's working in the city. Business poems are very, very rare. This one is different in that, as you've said, it is very personal. It's dealing with human relationships. And I thought when I first read the poems, the potential collection, what I was left with was a sense that these poems had been a long time in the making, that most of them couldn't have been written maybe 10 years ago, that there was the process of the memory and imagination coming together towards an understanding, which was very powerful in this. And the usual elements in Nigel's work of insight, honesty, wit, all of those elements are there too. But as we've just heard, there are some poems that are intensely personal and moving, and that have taken perhaps a lifetime of experience to be able to translate into poetry. So the process was that, really. I read all the poems that might go into the book, read them aloud, sort of assessed what I was left with for the overall shape of the book. But we were very, very lucky in that Nigel could come to Sheffield at that time. It was, before lockdown.
Of course.
So I could hear Nigel read them to me in his own voice, and then between us we could work out where the line endings really were, any further editing that might need doing, and then we could go off for lunch and recover from what is usually a very unsettling kind of experience. So we parted friends,
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Excuse me. I'm not that ruthless, but it was all right. So we did have that, and having absorbed Nigel's voice so thoroughly, when it was suggested that I would read a poem tonight, I thought, I can't shake off Nigel's voice, and I'm no good as a mimic. It was quite difficult.
I'm sure, but you've been very intimately involved with it, haven't you? It's hard to.
But I can only really his voice now with this. But there's one poem that I think exemplifies a lot of those qualities. The compassion, really, I would say, that's an element in most of these poems, and the kind of insight into human weakness and an understanding of how the speaker was at that time. And I think at the beginning, I'm going to read this one about, it's on the way home from choir practice. And at the beginning, what could be more virtuous than someone walking home from choir practice and we're very much on the side of the speaker for about 4 lines. And then Nigel overturns it very gently with a line beginning, "Oh." And then, you know, we start to see a very different view of what actually really happened. And then that reflection. I think quite a significant part of it is that what they've been practicing was the Kyrie, which is the plea for mercy. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. But we miss that. It's that very subtle undercurrent, you know, in the early part of the poem, which then comes back full force at the end. So I'll read that now.
Wonderful.
On the way home from choir practice, he was older and bigger than me, and his punch was as glorious and unexpected as when we trebles hit the top A in the Kyrie. I'd done nothing to deserve that. Oh, my outrage as I named him to the police. I wanted him tracked down, humiliated, punished. The doubts took years. Had I provoked him? Maybe I'd exaggerated my shock and the pain. His mother, when she came round to apologise, blaming it all on her being so ill with the cancer. How had she deserved that? And how had he? I pressed charges. Where was the mercy in that?
Wonderful, thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
I'm also delighted to have another guest here. We have George Littlejohn, who, a journalist for a number of years now, specialises in risk, which seems pertinent to our current moment, although I'm sure I've misunderstood exactly which kind of risk this is. In his role as senior advisor at the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, where, as I said, Nigel is poet in residence. So George, welcome.
Thank you, Martha. I'm delighted to be here tonight.
It's lovely to have you here. Why don't you please tell us a little bit about the CISI and about its poet in residence scheme, whether this is a brainchild of yours. I know that Nigel, of course, works partly in this world as well as being a poet, though it's up to him to decide which one is the moonlighting. But he must have seemed a perfect fit.
He was absolutely perfect. You know, Martha, you nailed it, as only a poet can, with one word earlier, was the word labyrinth. Briefly, the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment is the leading body globally for investment professionals, formerly part of London Stock Exchange. So our members give advice, good advice, in almost every case to their clients on investments. Nigel, as you say, works in the city, probably his day job, but his poetry is superb. The labyrinth word really matters, and I genuinely have never heard it applied to the City of London before, although it is so perfect. It's a huge territory with many dimensions, some of them rather dangerous financially these days. Samuel Pepys wrote about this labyrinth in his diaries, and perhaps Nigel is a Samuel Pepys of our day. Pepys had, like Nigel, very serious political connections, military connections, finance connections, and Pepys described this labyrinth both physically and in the way it works. And Nigel happens to be one of our most senior members, so it seemed natural for me to invite him, and he was very willing indeed, not to a scheme, but to be our poet in residence, and we hope he will remain there for a long time. He has got this wide experience in a number of areas. Data is the lifeblood of finance, but essentially there's just far too much of it. We all spend our days and evenings and mornings looking at screens full of figures, at pages full of figures, at PowerPoint presentations, and dare I say it, at webcasts, not unlike this one, but much less enjoyable than this one in most cases. These webcasts go on 24 hours a day, almost 7 days a week, and it's like drinking from a fire hydrant. It's almost impossible to drink the water coming at that speed, but what Nigel provides, like excellent poets like you, provide is the ability to, as it were, sit from a mountain stream, to savor what is appearing in a very few words, which can give a clear idea of what makes people tick.
Oh, that's fascinating. What a way to describe it. Thank you so much. And in the spirit of the launch of the book, I'd love for you to select a poem to read for us from It's Not Personal, and perhaps tell us a little bit about why you chose it and why you like it.
You know, it was very hard, Martha, to choose one of these many poems. I love them all. I could have chosen a dozen, but the one I chose is called Lockerbie, and you can probably guess what it's about, the dreadful incident some decades ago in Scotland. It's got many, many personal resonances. For instance, a young cousin of mine, now a very eminent academic here in London, was on her way to Scotland that night, and the days before Twitter and ubiquitous mobile telephones, we didn't know why she was very late back in Glasgow from London. We have friends who live near there who, for whatever reason, but possibly connected with this, we haven't actually seen since before then, and that's more than 30 years ago. We haven't seen people who've been very close friends and no falling out and so on. Or much later, I became very pally, and I'm with a very senior cancer doctor who managed to get the convicted bomber Abdel Basset al-Megrahi a sort of get out of jail pass when he was apparently dying of cancer pretty imminently. Got him back home to Libya, but he took a long while to pass to the other world. And this reminds me slightly of another gorgeous poem which I might have liked to have read, which follows on from Nigel's interview with MI6, which is Lunch with the MI6 Recruiter, which is one of the wittiest poems I've ever read. And when it comes to matters like the one I've just discussed, there's a wonderful sequence of taps on the table when people change the subject. But I guess my main reason for liking this poem is empathy with the likable man, Timothy Berman, who sadly died in that plane crash, one of Nigel's former colleagues, and in whose memory the poem is written. And maybe I like it because I've probably spent too much time over the decades and too much effort making sure I was in seat 34G on time. Let me read you this poem, if I may. Lockerbie. A likable young man, a recent recruit, in a hurry to prove himself, putting his hand to every task, on call to work for any director, sure to volunteer for every pitch, getting the knack of the new computer, first to his desk and last from the office, never seeing his home in daylight. A very likable man tidying his desk, taking off tasks from his penciled list, merger schedules past the team leader, dividend analysis completed and sent, briefing done for director's meeting, posting yellow notes for colleagues, updating, cajoling, reminding them they're covering for him over Christmas. Such a likable man, off to New York, pulling his suitcase from under his desk, deflecting the barbs of envious teammates, shouldering his coat and out onto Cheapside, ignoring the amber signs on taxis, taking a tube as the safest way to check in on time for seat 34G. Thank you, Nigel. And thank you, Martha.
Thank you, George. Wonderfully read. And really interesting to hear why you liked it as well. It's lovely to have that context from these early readers. I'd like to welcome Nigel back to the room, if he will come. Hello.
Here I am.
I won't ask you how it feels to have others read your poems aloud. I know that's a very strange sensation, but I hope a good and celebratory one for this launch. I found it really interesting just then hearing George describe the way that you're so firmly rooted in these two separate worlds, the business world and the poetry world, that as Anne said, aren't often found together. And I wanted to ask you whether for you they ever come into conflict in any way, or conversely, whether you find that they complement each other.
I think they complement each other. You said early on that, or perhaps it was Anne said, that not many people write about work, and that's true. But I really like writing about work because I think there are two things about work which suit it to poetry. The first is that there's the full range of emotions at work, from fear, greed, hate, through to joy, satisfaction, even love. All these things happen at work just as they happen at every other part of our life. But they're against a background of artifice, because the relationships we have at work are artificial. We don't talk to people in the same way at work as we would talk to them outside. We hold them in a different status in regard to ourselves. We say things we think they'd like to hear rather than what we really mean. And much of what happens at work is below the surface and is not what it seems on top. So for me, that's great fun, because I can draw all that out, and I can gently tease people and prod them about things they've done at work. And that went true. That was true too, also for the army, but in a different way. But particularly true in the civil service, and most recently in the city and business. It's a great subject for writing about, and I can't think why more people don't do it.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think a lot of the things you mentioned just then, that sort of secrecy or subterfuge or slight twisting of what you mean and what you say is absolutely the stuff of poetry, isn't it? And I think you're mining a rich theme. And you mentioned, of course, the city. We've talked about that, and the city, of course, is firmly situated in London, as are some of these poems. You know, there's a very recognisable London in this book. In one or two poems, there's Lambeth Palace and the London Eye and the House of Lords. But it feels quite a different London to the one that you have written about previously, which almost, to me, felt like when you've written about London previously, it's almost been like a character in the book. Do you feel that London as a place has sort of receded for you slightly in the writing of this book to make room for other things?
Yes, I do. I think you've put your finger on something there, which is that because this is more personal than things I've written about before, London provides the backdrop rather than the excuse for writing about things. So there is a poem, for example, where it physically does that, about being on a pleasure boat on the Thames, passing, as you mentioned, Lambeth Palace and the Eye. And it's useful for me to be able to set that out because it gives the reader a sense of what is happening to the character, the person who appears in the poem, who may or may not be me. Whereas when I was writing in earlier books, it had to be about London itself in some way, or about, in one case, about Germany itself, when I was writing about the Cold War. But this, because it's more personal, it's a gentler treatment of London, I guess. It's almost a friend.
Yeah.
Would you fancy reading a poem by any chance, Martha, if you've got one there that you'd like to read?
Well, that's a treat to be asked. Yes, please. I would love to read a poem. And the poem that I'd like to read is Moon Landing, which, for anyone who does have the book, is on page 26, if you'd like to read along. And I think what I like most about this poem is its handling of scale, I think. It says something that I think lies right at the very heart of the book as a whole. To me, it feels that there's this huge collective moment, this seismic event, the moon landing in the summer of 1969, with the whole world watching, and yet in this poem the moment is telescoped right down to the level of the personal, with the young boy, the protagonist, the speaker, just happening to glance away from the TV as his mum brings in the dinner, and so misses the moment. And there's something really endearing for me about that. And in fact, I don't think it detracts at all from the being there-ness of the event. You know, each person's experience must have been idiosyncratic, and it's remembered however it's remembered, and it is remembered here. And I find that very funny and very human. And I love the sort of absent-mindedness of the last line of this poem as well, which feels to me to sort of demonstrate the size of the universe, like a child flinging his arms wide. It's a great poem. Moon Landing. We had sausages for supper that evening, on trays in front of the TV, making an exception to Mum's rule. She brought the food through just as he came down the ladder. So I missed the actual moment when his foot hit the ground. I heard his voice, though, talking about steps, as if he were reading the football results. United States of America 1, Russia 0. Later, halfway through the apple crumble, the flag went up, held out sideways by wire, looking as if there was a good strong wind. And after I went to bed, he hit a golf ball, apparently, but no one knows where it went.
Thanks, Martha. That was really good.
I hope I
couldn't have done it better myself.
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you could. And perhaps we should, if only to spare my blushes, return to the poems in the voice of the author. I'd love to hear some more if you'd be so kind as to read us them.
Thank you. I'm going to start off by reading a couple of poems about business, following on really from what George was saying. I'll read two, one after the other. The first one is actually directly inspired by the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment, because it comes from a seminar that I attended. I think George was probably present. It was about risk, and it was part of the program of continuing professional development that you're expected to undertake as a member of the CISI. And it's an unexpected pleasure for me to go to these things because I keep learning new things, which after, I don't know, 30 odd years in the city, just still comes as a bit of a surprise. And then the second poem I'm going to read, which is called It's Business, is a poem which reflects experiences of a couple of the chief executives that I've worked with over the years, not altogether happy experiences in those cases. And it's a poem which gives rise to the title of the book, as you'll hear. But first, operational risk. It's not like credit risk, market risk, or liquidity risk. It's not a permissive risk where you can say, okay, we will take an acceptable level of exposure in pursuit of a quantifiable reward. No, it's a different risk. It's related to inherent factors, factors you can't control, measure, or predict. Like the risk a systems programmer misses a keystroke and cocks up the coding on your Black Scholes model, or someone doesn't do the know your counterparty checks, or an invisible glitch in your website turns away customers, or like the time your most trusted employee met the competition in a Morrison's car park and handed over confidential information for a brown paper bag of £50 notes. It's business, she said, from the chair he still thought of as his. New owners, new outlook. We need to make changes. Sure, we're serious, starting at the top. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. Not to do with your management style, the quality of your team, your rapport with your suppliers, or relationships with clients. All good. No, it's business. Just business. We're pleased with margins and cash flow, so we'll pay half your bonus and your long-term incentive. It's just that I'm taking over. Like I said, it's not personal. It's not personal, as I mentioned earlier on, is a good excuse for me for writing obliquely about some deeply personal things. And no more so, I suppose, than in the writing of this book about relationships, and specifically about the beginning and ending of relationships, which are often exciting, odd, bizarre, painful, funny, but which often leads the reader to judge the writer. And so the poems that are in this book about relationships might seem to be about me, but probably aren't, or might seem not to be about me, but maybe. And the one I'm going to read now is called Visiting Sloane Square. So for those not from London, I should explain that Sloane Square is a rather posh part of West London, home to a rather famous department store called Peter Jones. And I'll leave you to decide whether Visiting Sloane Square is about me or whether it's just an excuse for me to have some fun with the different sounds of words. So, Visiting Sloane Square. Slithering down her stairs, his heels slam slat by slat by slat, slashing his slight chance of slinking silently away. He's left a slick where he slathered and slobbered on the sleek silk of her pillow slip, then slumped into the slotted slab of her Peter Jones bed. He's praying she's still asleep as he slips the latch, sliding into his docks for the schlep up Sloane Street, where the sleet is slapping slantwise against the slates. My last two poems now are about my mother, and specifically about the time around her death. There are two of them. The first one is about the circumstances of her death, which is obviously a sad and painful event, even though it took place now nearly 10 years ago. It took place around Christmas, and that's reflected in the poem. And the second poem is an opportunity for me to pick out one of those moments on that period immediately before her death over Christmas, and remember her as I would like to remember her, which is a person full of fun, even when there were setbacks. For example, when her eyesight became so bad towards the end of her life that she got into a terrible muddle. She would laugh about it, and that was just great, and that's how I want to remember her. And this for me is one of the great things which poetry does. It enables you to put into words a moment of time which would otherwise be lost, and which you can come back to years later, read it again, and as it were, pick up that moment, turn it around, look at it from different angles, and say, yes, that's how it was. So these two poems, the first one is called Some Things About Last Christmas I'm Sure Of, and the second one, My Mother Mistakes Her Phone for a Shoe. So, some things about last Christmas I'm sure of. They set off for home at 6 on Boxing Day. It had been a busy Christmas for her. All the family had been demanding her attention. Once, she mistook her granddaughter's shoe for some new kind of mobile phone. We put that down to the macular degeneration. Another time, she couldn't get up the stairs. We thought it was tiredness. The call from my father came at 7 the next morning. I had the car keys in my hand when my son came downstairs. He said, "It's Gran, isn't it?" When I got to Milton Keynes, she was unconscious. The pneumonia did not respond to the drug of last resort. I knelt beside her bed and told her I loved her. I'm not sure whether she responded to my squeeze of her hand. My mother mistakes her phone for a shoe. I don't like to bother you, Doctor, but yesterday I used my shoe to make a telephone call. That can't be right, can it? Are folk now expected to hold footwear to their ear to talk to their brother in Dundee? I mean, what is the world coming to? For a start, I need to know whether I'm still able to talk privately. What if someone is listening on a shoe nearby? Can they hear what I'm saying? Because I wouldn't want my brother's dirty linen washed in public. He wouldn't like that. They're very straight-laced in Dundee, you know. Can you tell me, Doctor, if I can only talk to people with court shoes like mine, or have they made arrangements for slippers? And are boots on a different network? And what about where they don't have shoes? How will the poor people cope? And Doctor, the bill, will it come from Freeman, Hardy and Willis? Oh, my nerves are in a right old state about this shoe phone business, Doctor. Is there anything you can give me?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nigel. Now, don't go anywhere, because I think we've got a couple of questions for you from the audience over
Excellent.
on YouTube. First of all, a question from Fiona, who asks, Nigel, how old were you when you first wrote a poem that you can remember and were proud of?
First poem I could remember is not the same as the first poem I'm proud of. You'll not be surprised anymore, Fiona. But the first poem I was proud of was one which was written in response to a competition in my local paper, the Leighton Buzzard Observer. And that competition was for a spring poem. And I wrote a 3-verse poem saying, if you want to see spring, get out there and look at it, instead of writing about it, more or less. And to my great surprise, I won. But I'd been very nervous about putting a poem in the competition. So I put it in under a nom de plume. And what I did was to reverse my Christian name and my initials so that it read Pale Gin, which is Nigel AP backwards. And they duly put Pale Gin under the poem. And I said to my parents, look, I've won this competition. And they didn't believe me. So I had to show them how.
Stories seem to include some funny, archaic little corner of English life, don't they? I was just remembering fondly the poetry competition in the village show when I was growing up, and there was always a scandal, plagiarism or something, you know, in the village tent. We have one more question from Yvonne, who would like to ask you about the charity, about the North London Action for Homelessness, and whether you have a personal connection with that charity.
Not in the sense that I'm personally involved with helping them, but it is the closest charity to where I live, which helps homeless people. And you can't walk around my bit of North London without meeting homeless people. And indeed, Finsbury Park station, which I walk through very regularly, has a whole pavement on which homeless people sleep. And obviously they want help and support, and people like this charity give to help them by inviting them for meals and for practical help. And I just think it's a great thing they do. And I was very pleased, therefore, that when we approached Leslie to use her image for the cover, she said, why don't I choose a charity which helped homelessness, and she would waive her fee and give it to them. Well, just seemed a great thing to do, and I'm glad we've raised some more money for them as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic, really fantastic. And I think we've got time for just one more question from Tony Cohen, who first of all says, lovely, Nigel, thank you. And then asks, how much rewriting do you do on the poems? And when do you decide to stop?
Well, a lot, I think, is the answer on many of them. And indeed, I think if I think a poem is finished, it almost always isn't, or it's a very bad poem. It's quite often I find I don't actually know what a poem's about until I've written it and rewritten it. And quite often I start off with a poem being about one thing and it becomes about another, because in the course of working on it, I think of another angle or another idea, which adds new light to the poem. So we heard Anne very nicely read the poem about On the Way Home from Choir Practice. When I first wrote that, I hadn't thought of including the reference to Kyrie. The Kyrie eleison was indeed something which we used to sing in practice and in church. And I suddenly thought, well, actually what this poem is about a failure to behave in the way you set your own standards. And what more pertinent way of expressing that in relation to mercy is to make the link between the Kyrie eleison and the events. And so the early versions of that poem wouldn't have had that in, and it came in part the way through. And probably, if I'm honest, Tony, I should have continued working a lot more on some of the others, and you'd have a better collection in front of you today if I had done. But there comes a time when Anne has a deadline, I've got a deadline, and you just have to hand them in.
Oh, come now. I think you're doing it a disservice there. I'm going to ask one final question from Barbara, who wants to know, which poem in this new book do you think Jean admires most?
Jean, for those who don't know, is my wife and herself a poet, a much better poet than I am, I have to say. Do you know, I don't know. I'm very wary about asking Jean about my poems because her own standards are very high and she writes a different kind of poetry to me. So I'm sure she does have favorites, but I've never asked her, and I'm going to do that. after we finish this, I'll probably get a flea in my ear for not knowing which he likes the most. But there we are. It's got me into trouble.
You've got a task to take away there. Do some research. Well, I think we'd love to hear one more poem before we sign off for the night. So I hope you'll read us one more. But before that, I'd just like to say some thank yous. I'd like to say thank you so much to Ann Sansom of the Poetry Business and to George Littlejohn of CISI for being here and for their hard work and support of this wonderful new book. And thanks also to Katie and Susanna at the Poetry Business for running the behind the scenes, which is much fiddlier than it probably seems on YouTube. And thank you, of course, to you, the audience, for tuning in at home. And please do seek out and buy a copy of It's Not Personal, this wonderful book, which you can order via the link you'll see on your screens below. And there are also links there to CISI, to Leslie Oldacre's work, and to North London Action for the Homeless, to which, again, if you can, please do donate a little bit of money. And finally, thank you, a big thank you, of course, to Nigel Pantling, who will wrap up the evening by reading one more poem for us from his new book, It's Not Personal. Nigel, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you for being such a kind and gracious host this evening and for navigating us safely through the last hour. I'm going to read one final poem then, as Martha suggests. And unlike many of the poems in this book, which are backward looking, this one is forward looking. And it's dedicated to my granddaughter, Mila May Neve, and it's called Seedling. Late in the evening, deep in the Blackdown woodlands, where foxgloves stand like purple torches along my path, I slip, and falling, see an acorn seedling, no bigger than my hand, still bearing fragments of the dried leaves and pine needles it had to push through to reach the daylight. Daylight whose variations and regularities must still be as unknowable to that seedling as the meaning of the squeaks of fledglings in the beech tree, or the play of the wind, or the smoky taste of rain, or the unreliable companionship of the bracken with its busy fronds, here today and gone tomorrow, or the nearness of full-grown oaks, solid, long-lived, and understanding these things. And I think of the impossibly small hand of my new granddaughter, who has yet to make any sense of her world, and of how she will grow tall and strong, learn all there is to know, and outlast me. Thank you for listening, and good night.